This week's project is going to be a little different. It's a tri-cornered bowl. I start with a cube of wood that you can see here mounted in my lathe, and we are going to turn it into, again, this three-cornered bowl. So to get started, the first thing I do is I remove everything from my drive center. Also the live center, you'll see that I've got an old live center that I had that I removed the center pin, so it's now functioning as a cup. Inside of this, I'll mount my wooden cube, and this is what I'm going to start with. Here I just tighten up my tailstock because friction is the only thing that's causing this wooden block to spin. And I'm able to get fairly good speed on it. I was able to start out at 300 or 400 RPM. So I adjust my tool rest so that I can start working on what's going to be the bottom of the bowl. So the first step is to try and make it round, and also to form the tenon on the bottom of the bowl. Right here, about a couple inches up from the bottom, is where the tenon is going to be. So the material that's below that, I will not be using. Now you can see here in the beginning, I'm turning a lot of air. I'm only hitting the very edges. So until I start to get this round, there is a fair bit of bouncing on my tool. The other thing is I make sure that I consistently tighten up the tailstock so that it does not get loose on me. In the beginning, I've switched around from using my bowl gouge to my carbide tool, depending on which is working better at the time. The carbide tool seems to work well when I'm turning a lot of air, although it's a much lighter cut and therefore going much slower. You can see here that the bowl is starting to get a little more cone shaped on the bottom. There is still a bit of tear out. You can see the rough edges there. They'll get smoother as the bowl gets round. Again, they're happening because it's bouncing. At this point, I'm just marking a line across the top. These will be roughly where the 3 points on the corner of the bowl will end up being. So I can see this line now as it's spinning, so I know that I'm safe working below that. And again, just trying to make that part below that line round as quickly as possible. So I did a little more rounding off camera, and you can see now that it's fairly round and the tenon is formed. You'll also see that as I made it round, I did end up coming beyond those black lines that I had. Because this was not a perfect cube, its dimensions varied from one side to the other. It was more rectangular shaped. I did not end up hitting those points right on the corners. That's okay. All that happens is I just travel a little further up the cube, but at the same time still maintaining that crisp square edge. Now I'll start working the top a little bit, and this is just to remove excess material before I cut the tenon off the bottom and I mount it in my chuck. This does a few things for me. It helps get rid of a lot of weight. This block is still fairly heavy. It's a little wet. I did put it in my kiln, but it's still a little wet and it is heavy. So removing a lot of this material before I put it in my chuck will just make it easier on that tenon, because I do not want to break that off. One of the things I have to be very careful of when working the inside of that bowl is, especially as I remove material, I'm going to end up with just those 3 points coming around, and I want to make sure that I don't at any point catch those. I still have a little bit of work to do on the outside here. I had a tiny bit of tear out just in one spot and a couple tool marks. So I'm just using my round nose scraper just to remove those lines and make the surface ready for sanding. And you can see here that those edges are getting fairly crisp. So I just continue nibbling away at the top of this bowl. I stop it frequently just to make sure the location of those points, because I do not want to remove so much material that I end up losing those points. So I stop it just to check the thickness and make sure that I'm still only removing the material that I want to. Now you will see here every once in a while the tool grabs a little bit and the bowl stops spinning for a quick second. Again, at this point, I'm still just a friction. I'm just relying on the tension between the two centers to allow that to spin. Once I remove it from between centers and put it into my chuck, then the slipping will no longer be an issue. Here's a really good shot of where the corner ended up being versus where I thought it would be. Again, this is because I was not starting with a perfect cube. And again, that's okay. The corner point just moved a little further up the bowl. You can see that it's still in line with the original edge as shown here on the arrow. Here I'm just going over the outside of the bowl with my negative rake scraper. I stop frequently, inspect the work, and then go over it again. It may seem like I'm spending a lot of time at this step, but this is a very important step to do. Spending 5 minutes here with a negative rake scraper to remove fine lines can save me a half an hour in sanding, and nobody enjoys sanding. So now you can see I flipped this around, mounted it in my chuck, so I've got a much more positive drive for the bowl. And now I'm just working the inside, being very, very careful to make sure that I don't come in contact with those edges. Unfortunately, there's not a lot to see when I'm doing the inside. It's hard to get the camera in a good spot because I am blocking the opening and it is a relatively small diameter bowl at 6 inches. So I'm not going to show a lot of the inside, but here you can see just from the wood chips that are coming off that my bowl gouge is doing a good job at removing material inside this bowl. And I do stop frequently just to make sure that I check the thickness and that I don't go too thin. One of the advantages of this type of bowl is you can see here as I stop it, it's easy to see the thickness of the bowl and make sure it's uniform because I can see that on those edges that are exposed. So I stop often and feel the inside to see where I need to make adjustments. And then you can see here what I'll do is I'll hold my tool up and sometimes even make a mark on my tool rest so I know where to start from. Because areas that I've already thinned, I don't want to go over those again. So again, I just stop on quite frequently, check it, and then just make sure I work that area that is required. On the sides of the bowl, I used my carbide tool, but on the bottom, I was able to use my scraper. I did not use a scraper on the side. With the discontinued edge, it was too likely to have a catch, but on the bottom, I was able to do that. So let's talk a little bit about this bowl. It's called a tri-corner bowl for obvious reasons. I have a corner here, here, and here. I started with a rectangular block. I've been following some other turners online. Some of them start with a cube, a perfect cube. I did not. And what a perfect cube means in the end is that these 3 points will be at the same height. Mine are not. You'll see, I don't know if you can tell here, but because I had a rectangle to start with, some of the points are a bit higher than others. The bowl is not quite finished, and it's not going to be. Unfortunately, this one's going to be fancy firewood. It was wet to start with, and I knew that, and I'd put in my kiln and hoped it would dry, but it was still wet, and it's developed a crack here, and I could try and fill that, but I just don't think it's worth it. It still has some tool marks. I would have, if it hadn't been for that crack, I would have just done some scraping with a scraper to remove those tool marks, but generally I'm pretty pleased with the way it turned out. One of the things with these tri-corner bowls is you want to try and make this even thickness, and it's not bad. You can see it's a little thicker right here than it is up at the tips. So again, had I have continued with this, I would have taken that down a little bit further just to make that uniform. But overall it turned out well, and it was a good learning experience, and I will try one again. Next time I'll just do one that's a little drier to start with. Unfortunately, when I brought it up to show it to my wife, she said she hated it. So chances are I won't be turning one for her, but maybe one will be for sale in the near future.